Okay, welcome back to the third lesson here for geometry remediation. Looking at the lesson here, you can see that the objective is, given a scenario, students will be able to determine the length of the hypotenuse of a right triangle with 100% accuracy. So let's go straight into example 1. Miss Galliotto drives 7 miles east and then 24 miles south. What is the diagonal distance from her starting point? So if you look at the objective where you have to determine the length of the hypotenuse of a right triangle, and then you look at the first example we're working on, you should notice that we're missing something. We're missing that right triangle. So the first thing we have to do is draw a picture. So we're going to have Miss Galliotto start right here. Right here is her house. That's our starting point. And she's driving 7 miles east. So she gets in her car, she drives 7 miles east. And then 24 miles south. And we want to know the diagonal distance from our starting point. So we want to know this distance right here. And right here is our right triangle. So to determine this diagonal distance, or what we call the hypotenuse, remember, this side is opposite the right angle. So this is what we call the hypotenuse of a right triangle because it's opposite the right angle. And then these two sides of the right triangle are called legs. Now, to determine the hypotenuse of this right triangle, we're going to use the Pythagorean theorem, which states a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And that is the Pythagorean theorem. Pythagorean theorem says a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So you might be asking yourself, well, where do these a, b's, and c's come from? Well, they come from the parts of this right triangle. Each leg is either A or B, and it doesn't matter which one you label it. So I'm going to label this leg right here with the 7 miles. I'm going to label that leg A. So this will be side A, or leg A. This will be leg B. The only part of this that does matter is that the hypotenuse is always C. So hypotenuse is always C. So we're going to substitute 7 in for A, so we're going to have 7 squared plus 24 squared equals C squared. And we go to our graphing calculator. And once we have our graphing calculator, we're going to type in 7 squared, which is right here, the fifth key down, on the left. 7 squared plus 24 squared. And we hit enter, and we get 625. So seven squared plus 24 squared is 625, and that's going to equal c squared. Now, we have to get to c. We don't want c squared. So we have to undo this square here. We undo a square by using a square root. So on our graphing calculator, once again, we're going to do the square root. And now the square root is, if you look at where my cursor is, it's right above that x squared. It's that blue symbol right there. So in order to get to that, we have to hit second first. We're going to hit second, and then we're going to hit that x squared button. And notice the square root pops up on the calculator there. And we're going to take the square root of 625, and that is 25. So our C value is 25. So to answer the question, what is the diagonal distance from Miss Galliotto's starting point? It is 25 miles. Okay, looking at example 2. Mr. Warnock drives 9 miles west and then 40 miles north. What is the diagonal distance from his starting point? So here's my house. And I'm driving 9 miles west. So that's 9 miles. And then 40 miles north. So right there is that right angle. And we want to find that diagonal distance, represented here by this dotted line. Once again, we have a right triangle. We're trying to find, remember, this is the side opposite the right angle, so we're trying to find the hypotenuse again. So we use Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Remember, the 9 and the 40 are two legs, so this is a leg, and this right here is a leg. And each one of these are a and b in our theorem. It doesn't matter which one you label a and which one you label b. So I'll call 9a and 40b. And the hypotenuse, remember, that is always c. So we'll have 9 squared plus 40 squared equals c squared. Going back to the calculator, 9 squared plus 40 squared, that's 1,681. And then once again, we have to take the square root of that. So we do second, hit that x squared so the square root comes up of 1,681. And you get c to equal 41. So our c value is 41. So the answer to that question, what is the diagonal distance, is going to be 41 miles. Looking at example 3, Mrs. Warnock drives 8 miles south and then 15 miles east. What is the diagonal distance from her starting point? So once again, here's Mrs. Warnock's house. She's driving 8 miles south. And then 15 miles east. Right here is that right angle, representing that it's a right triangle. And we want to find this diagonal distance. So once again, we're going to use the Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. We're trying to find the side opposite the right angle, so that's going to be the hypotenuse. Remember, the other two sides of a right triangle, we call those legs. Remember, our hypotenuse is always the c value, and the legs are a or b, doesn't matter what you label them. So this will be a, and this side will be b. And we're going to substitute that into the Pythagorean theorem. So 8 squared plus 15 squared is going to equal c squared. C is what we're trying to find. Going back to the calculator, eight squared plus 15 squared, that will equal 289. So 289 equals c squared. And to just solve for c, we now have to take the square root. Going back to the calculator, we take the square root of 289. And we get c to equal 17. So the answer to the question, what is the diagonal distance from our starting point? That will be 17 miles. That concludes the third remediation lesson in geometry. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to ask your math teacher.